She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. When Helena Montenegro found her husband in the arms of another woman, she simply turned around and walked away into the rain, carrying nothing but a photograph and a silence that cut deeper than any words ever could. Leonardo Castelli thought he knew everything about her. He was wrong about all of it, and by the time he figured that out, the world was already falling at her feet. What happens when the woman you underestimated becomes the one everyone else can't stop talking about? Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The city had been holding its breath all evening. By 9 o'clock, Manhattan was drowning. Sheets of rain hammering the glass towers of the Upper East Side like something biblical, like the sky itself had grown tired of pretending everything was fine. The streets below gleamed with a cold, indifferent light, and the few people still outside moved quickly, heads down, coats pulled tight, as if they knew better than to linger in a night like this. Helena Montenegro had been in Boston for 4 days. She hadn't called ahead. There was no reason to. It was her home, after all, or at least that was what the deed said. She rode the elevator up to the 14th floor with her leather overnight bag over one shoulder, her dark hair damp at the edges from the brief walk between the car and the lobby. She was wearing a deep burgundy coat, fitted at the waist, the kind of coat that made people look twice without quite knowing why. Her heels were quiet against the marble. Her breathing was steady. She noticed the extra glass on the kitchen counter before she noticed anything else. It was the kind of detail most people would have missed. A second glass of red wine, barely touched, set just slightly apart from Leonardo's as though someone had tried to create the illusion of distance. Helena stood very still in the entryway, the overnight bag still on her shoulder, and looked at it for a long moment. Then she heard the voice, low, feminine, coming from upstairs. She didn't rush. She climbed the stairs the same way she always did, one hand trailing lightly along the railing, her posture straight, her pace unhurried. Later, she would not be able to explain why she felt no panic. Only something cold and clarifying, like stepping into ice water and discovering, with some distant surprise, that you could breathe in it. The bedroom door was open. She didn't push it wider. She stood in the frame and looked, and what she saw arranged itself in her mind with a terrible, clean precision. Leonardo on the edge of the bed, his shirt half open, and Bianca Valenza. She recognized the woman immediately, the sharp cheekbones, the practiced ease, sitting beside him with her hand on his jaw like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. For a moment, no one moved. Then Bianca saw her. The woman's face changed, not with guilt, Helena noticed, but with something more complicated. Calculation, maybe, or curiosity about what Helena would do next. Leonardo turned. Helena! His voice came out wrong, too loud, then too quiet. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked the bedside lamp. This isn't... I can explain. She didn't let him finish. Not because she was being dramatic, simply because there was nothing he could say that she wanted to hold in her memory. She turned around and walked back down the stairs. Helena. His footsteps behind her now, heavy and urgent. Helena, stop! She went to the study. She knew exactly what she was looking for. The bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, the one Leonardo had never opened because he'd always assumed it held old paperwork, contained a small fireproof box. She lifted it out with both hands, set it on the desk, and opened it with a key she kept on her keychain. Inside, a passport, 3 folded documents, and a photograph. She took all of it. The photograph she looked at for just a moment, a younger version of herself, standing in a lab she hadn't seen in 5 years, smiling the way people smile when they don't yet know what they're about to give up. She tucked it carefully between the documents. Leonardo appeared in the doorway. He had pulled his shirt closed. Behind him, somewhere on the stairs, she could sense Bianca listening. "Say something," he said. His voice had dropped to something almost unrecognizable. "Please yell at me, do something." Helena closed the box, set it back in the drawer, and picked up her overnight bag from where she'd left it by the door. "There's nothing to say, Leonardo." "That's insane. You walk in, you don't even ask—" "Ask what?" She looked at him then, directly, without anger and without tears. Just that clear, steady gaze that had always made him slightly uneasy, though he'd never admitted it. "There's nothing to ask. I saw what I saw. You're not even going to fight for this." Something moved through her eyes. Not pain exactly. Something older than pain. "No," she said simply. She walked past him into the hallway. She pressed the elevator button. She waited, perfectly still, while the numbers climbed. "Where are you going?" he called from the doorway. His voice edged with something he didn't know how to name yet. Not love, not guilt. Something stranger, something that felt almost like fear. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. She didn't look back. Outside, the rain fell on a city that didn't know it yet, didn't know that the woman walking through it, unhurried and dry-eyed, was carrying 5 years of silence in that leather bag, and a mind that had already begun, very quietly, to imagine what came next. Leonardo stood in the hallway of the apartment for a long time after the elevator doors closed. The second glass of wine sat on the kitchen counter behind him, still untouched. He had expected tears. He had expected a door slammed hard enough to shake the walls, accusations thrown like furniture, the particular theatre of a marriage coming undone. He had expected something he could respond to, defend against, explain away, survive. He had not expected that. The silence she left behind was a different kind of silence than the apartment had ever held before. It pressed against the walls. It sat in the furniture. It made the whole place feel, for the first time, like somewhere he didn't quite recognize. Bianca appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression carefully composed. "She'll come back," she said. "Women like that always—" "Go home, Bianca." His voice was quiet, final. He walked to the window and stood there for a long time, looking down at the rain-slicked street below. Somewhere in the dark and the wet, a pair of headlights moved steadily away from the building, unhurried and certain, until they disappeared around a corner. And Leonardo Castelli, who had never in his adult life been left without the last word, stood at the glass and felt something he couldn't name settle into his chest like a stone, heavy and cold and very, very still. Chicago greeted him with grey skies and the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Leonardo Castelli had been telling himself for 3 days that he was fine, that this was manageable, that Helena's departure was, if he was being honest with himself, which he was trying very hard not to be, something he had on some level anticipated. Marriages frayed, people drifted. These things happened to other people all the time, and those people survived, rebuilt, moved forward. He was Leonardo Castelli. He had built an aerospace empire from a single patent and a borrowed office in Queens. He did not unravel over a woman who walked out without raising her voice. He repeated this to himself in the back of the car from O'Hare, watching the city materialize through rain-streaked glass. By the time he reached the hotel, he almost believed it. The Meridian Aerospace Conference occupied 3 floors of the Langham, all polished surfaces and controlled lighting, and the particular hum of serious money in quiet conversation. Leonardo moved through it the way he always did, with the ease of a man who understood that rooms like this ran on confidence as much as capital. Hands were shaken, names were exchanged. Someone from a German defense contractor laughed too loudly at something he said. He smiled at the right moments. He ordered the right drink. He was performing, and he knew it, and he was very good at it. It was during the late afternoon break, in a quieter corridor near the conference room's east exit, that Riccardo Valente found him. Ricardo was one of the few people Leonardo genuinely respected, a structural engineer turned venture capitalist who had the rare quality of saying exactly what he meant without making it feel like an attack. They'd known each other for 11 years. Ricardo had been at their wedding. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," Ricardo said, handing him a coffee without being asked. "I slept fine." "You look like a man who hasn't slept," Ricardo repeated, undisturbed. Leonardo accepted the coffee. They stood together for a moment in the way old friends can, without needing to fill the silence immediately. "Helena left," Leonardo said finally. The words came out flatter than he intended. Ricardo didn't react with surprise. He nodded slowly, turning the cup in his hand. "When?" "4 nights ago." "Did she say where she was going?" "She didn't say anything." Leonardo paused. That was the strange part. She walked in, found the situation, went to the study, took some documents and left. No argument, no scene. Ricardo was quiet for a moment. That doesn't sound like nothing. That sounds like someone who had already decided. Leonardo felt a flicker of something uncomfortable move through him and pushed it back down. She'll surface. She doesn't have... She's been out of the workforce for years. We have a lifestyle that requires... Leonardo. Ricardo's voice was gentle but precise, the way a scalpel is gentle. "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to regardless." "Did you ever ask her about her life? Before you?" The question landed strangely. Leonardo turned to look at him. "What do you mean? We were married for 5 years." "That's not what I asked." Ricardo met his eyes without apology. "I mean the specifics. What she studied, what she worked on, what she gave up or didn't. Did you know her, the way you know a person you've actually been curious about?" The corridor felt slightly smaller than it had a moment ago. "I knew her," Leonardo said. The words came out with less certainty than he'd intended. "What's her last name? Her maiden name?" The silence that followed was only 3 seconds long, but it was 3 seconds too long and both men knew it. Leonardo opened his mouth, closed it. The truth was absurd. He knew it was absurd even as it surfaced. But the name simply wasn't there. In 5 years of marriage, across hundreds of social events and business dinners and quiet mornings in the apartment they shared, her original surname had simply never become something he'd needed to know. She was Helena Castelli. She had been Helena Castelli from the moment she signed the marriage certificate, and before that she had been... "I don't..." He stopped. Ricardo didn't say "I told you so." He just looked at him with the particular sadness of someone watching a smart man realize something that should have been obvious a long time ago. 11 years I've known you," Ricardo said quietly. "And in that time I've watched you learn the market cap of every competitor, the background of every board member, the history of every company you've ever acquired. You know things about people, Leonardo. When you want to. That's different." "Is it?" Leonardo set the coffee cup down on the windowsill beside him. Outside, Chicago spread itself under a flat gray sky, indifferent and enormous. "I assumed she seemed content." The word felt wrong the moment he said it. She managed the household, the social calendar, She seemed content, Ricardo said, because you never asked whether she was. The conference room doors opened behind them, releasing a wave of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee. People began moving back inside for the next session. Ricardo straightened his jacket and gave Leonardo a look that was neither judgment nor pity, but something more difficult, the look of a person handing you a mirror and waiting. "Find out who she is," he said simply, "not who you needed her to be." He walked back into the conference room. Leonardo didn't follow immediately. He stood in the corridor with the untouched coffee going cold beside him and felt Ricardo's questions settle somewhere behind his sternum, with the dull, specific weight of something that had been true for a long time without him noticing. "You ever ask her about the life she had before you?" He tried again to retrieve the name. Her name. The one she'd been born with, that had belonged to her for 20-something years before he'd ever appeared in her life. Nothing. He pulled out his phone, stared at her contact. Helena, no last name, because of course he'd never needed one, and felt the first genuine crack appear in the certainty he'd been carrying since that rainy night in Manhattan. Not guilt, exactly. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that required more honesty than he was comfortable with. He had a wife. He had shared a bed with her, a home, a name. And somewhere in this city or the next one or somewhere he couldn't yet imagine, she was moving through the world with a history he had never once thought to ask about. The conference room filled again behind him, voices rising, deals beginning to take shape in quiet corners. Leonardo Castelli stood in the corridor alone, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he had no idea what came next. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. It was unremarkable in every way. Standard white, no return address, the kind of thing that might contain a utility bill or a routine legal notice. Ottavio Mendez had a talent for that. In 15 years of private investigation, the man had perfected the art of delivering devastation in the most ordinary packaging possible. He set it on Leonardo's desk without ceremony, declined the offer of coffee and left without a word, which was, Leonardo had learned, how Ottavio signaled that what was inside required solitude. Leonardo waited until the office door clicked shut. Then he waited another full minute, his hands flat on the desk on either side of the envelope, looking at it the way a man looks at a test result he already suspects won't go in his favor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Castelli Aerospace headquarters, Manhattan performed its usual indifference, 10,000 windows catching the morning sun, the East River, a flat silver ribbon in the distance, the city proceeding without the faintest interest in whatever was about to happen in this particular office on this particular morning. He opened the envelope. The report was 41 pages. He knew within the first 3 that something fundamental was about to shift. By page 7, he had stopped breathing normally. By page 12, he had stood up from his desk, walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a long moment before forcing himself to sit back down and continue. Helena Montenegro. The name arrived first, and it already felt like an accusation, because of course it did, because he hadn't known it, and now here it was in clean black type, 2 words that belonged to a person he had apparently been living beside for 5 years, without ever seeing clearly. She had been born in Porto Alegre, raised partly in Brazil, partly in Switzerland, after her father, Enrique Montenegro, founder of Montenegro Sistemas, a mid-size aerospace engineering firm, relocated the family for a contract with the European Space Agency. She had been, by every account Ottavio had assembled, a remarkable student, the kind of remarkable that didn't announce itself loudly, but simply kept producing results that made other people uncomfortable. She had entered MIT at 19. She had left with 2 doctorates. Leonardo read that sentence 3 times, not because he didn't understand it, but because his mind kept trying to reconcile it with the woman who had sat across from him at 100 dinner parties, who had smiled at the right moments and deferred to his expertise in conversations about propulsion systems, his supposed area of authority, and said almost nothing, who had seemed, in those moments, simply gracious, simply quiet, simply content. Ricardo's word came back to him like something thrown. The first doctorate was in aerospace engineering. The second, and here Leonardo set the papers down on the desk and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, was in advanced materials science with a specialization in high-efficiency propulsion systems. Her dissertation, according to Ottavio's notes, had been cited 47 times in peer-reviewed journals in the 3 years after its publication. One of those citations was in a paper produced by a research division of Castelli Aerospace. His own company had cited his wife's work, and he had not known she existed. He turned to the financial section. This was where Ottavio's report became almost surreal, not because the numbers were impossible, but because they were so specific, so documented, so utterly, calmly real. The Montenegro family fortune, inherited by Helena following her father's death 4 years into their marriage, a death Leonardo had attended the funeral for, had stood beside her at, had held her hand through, was valued at approximately $530 million, distributed across a mix of real estate holdings, tech investments, and a significant stake in Montenegro Sistemas, which had been quietly acquired by a larger aerospace conglomerate 2 years prior at a valuation. that had made headlines in 3 countries. Leonardo had read about that acquisition. He had not connected the name, because he had not known her name. He sat for a very long time after that. The office held its particular silence, that specific, expensive quiet that New York reserves for rooms above the 40th floor, where the city noise reduces itself to something almost abstract. His assistant knocked once, tentatively, at 11:15. He didn't respond. She didn't knock again. There was one more section. Personal notes, Ottavio called it, though that was perhaps too gentle a term for what it contained. Helena had continued working during their marriage, not publicly, not under her name, not in any way that would have shown up in a casual search or a dinner party conversation, but working, quietly and consistently, through a private research arrangement with a laboratory in New Jersey that she had funded herself. The project was listed in Ottavio's notes simply as Project Meridian, its precise nature still partially obscured behind NDAs and corporate structure. But the laboratory director, interviewed without knowing the reason, had described it as, and Ottavio had underlined this, the most significant advance in propulsion efficiency he had seen in 20 years of the field. She had been building something, while living in his house, attending his dinners, deferring graciously and silently to his expertise in a subject she understood better than he did, and he had never once asked. Leonardo reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, not thinking exactly, just moving, and found what his hand was looking for before he'd consciously decided to look for it. The photograph. The one from the night she left, the one that had been in the fireproof box in the study, and which he had retrieved from the box the morning after and kept without fully understanding why. He looked at it now properly for the first time. She was younger in it, mid-20s maybe, standing in a lab he didn't recognize, wearing a white coat over what appeared to be a rose-colored blouse, her dark hair pulled back practically. She was looking at something off-camera, and the expression on her face was one he realized with a slow and clarifying shock that he had never seen her wear in 5 years of marriage. She looked completely, entirely, unapologetically herself. Not gracious, not deferential, not composed for someone else's benefit. Just alive. Lit from the inside by something she cared about more than his opinion of her. He set the photograph down on top of the 41 pages of a woman he had apparently never known. Outside, Manhattan kept moving. Somewhere to the west or the south, or in some city he couldn't name yet, Helena Montenegro was doing whatever Helena Montenegro did when no one who'd underestimated her was watching. And Leonardo Castelli sat alone in his very expensive, very quiet office, with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood something he cannot unknow, and felt the ground beneath everything he thought he knew begin, very slowly, to shift. San Francisco wore the evening like it had been dressed by someone who understood theater. The bay caught the last of the light in long copper ribbons, and the skyline beyond the glass walls of the Ferrers Aerospace penthouse suite did exactly what skylines do when architects and nature agree on something. It made people feel, without quite being able to explain why, that they were standing at the edge of something important. The kind of room where futures got decided over wine that cost more than most people's rent, where handshakes carried the weight of legislation, and where the right conversation at the right moment could redirect the course of an entire industry. Helena had worn rose gold. Not because she was trying to make an impression, though she would inevitably make one, but because it was the dress she had bought for herself 6 weeks ago in a small boutique in Cambridge, the morning after she'd finalized the last clause in her agreement with Ferrers Aerospace, and she had bought it the way a person buys something when they are finally, after a very long time, shopping only for themselves. It fit perfectly. It always had. She arrived 12 minutes after the event began, late enough to move through a room that was already in motion, early enough that the energy hadn't yet peaked into the self-congratulatory haze that overtook these things by 9 o'clock. A woman named Petra, Augusto Ferraz's head of strategic partnerships, met her at the entrance with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that certain guests required a different kind of welcome. Dr. Montenegro. Petra smiled with her whole face, the kind of smile that isn't performance. Augusto has been looking forward to this all week. "As have I," Helena said, and meant it. The room opened around her as she moved into it. She was aware, with the peripheral clarity that years of navigating rooms like this had given her, of the small adjustments people made as she passed, the conversations that paused half a beat, the glances that lingered. Not because of the dress, or not only. There was something else, something she was still getting used to after years of carefully suppressing it, the particular frequency a person emits when they have stopped pretending to be less than they are. She had been pretending for a long time. She wasn't pretending anymore. Augusto Ferraz found her near the bar, or perhaps she found him. It was the kind of meeting that felt mutual from the first moment. He was 61, compact and precise in the way of men who have been underestimated, and have used that underestimation strategically for decades. His eyes were the eyes of someone who paid attention to what other people overlooked. They shook hands, and he held hers a moment longer than custom required, not with any inappropriate intention, but with the specific warmth of someone recognizing a peer. "I've read everything," he said without preamble. "Everything?" She raised an eyebrow. "The MIT dissertations, both of them. The Meridian preliminary data your legal team sent last month." He paused. "The 47 citations." Something moved through her. Not quite surprise, not quite pleasure, but close to both. The feeling of being seen by someone who had done the work of looking. "Then you know I'm not here to be modest about it," she said. Augusto laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine. "Thank God for that. Modesty is extraordinarily expensive in this industry." They found a quieter corner near the window, the bay spread out behind them like something a production designer had ordered. A waiter materialized with 2 glasses of a Napa Cabernet that Helena recognized and approved of. They began to talk, not the careful circling conversation of people feeling out an adversary, but the direct, accelerating exchange of 2 people who have both been waiting for this particular conversation and didn't realize it until it was already happening. She talked about propulsion efficiency, the way most people talk about things they love, with an unself-consciousness that made the technical details feel almost intimate. Augusto listened the way exceptional people listen, without waiting for his turn to speak, without performing interest, with the still and focused attention of someone genuinely receiving what was being said. "The current industry benchmark for fuel efficiency in mid-range orbital systems is approximately 63%, Helena said, turning her wineglass slowly in her fingers. "Meridian's preliminary data puts us at 81. Conservative estimate." Augusto was quiet for a moment. Outside, a container ship moved slowly across the darkening bay. "That's not an improvement," he said. "That's a reclassification." "Yes," she said simply. "And you developed this when, over what period?" "A beat. Over the last 4 years." She didn't offer the context behind those 4 years. She didn't say, "While living in a marriage where my husband attended conferences on aerospace propulsion and came home to discuss them with me as though I were an intelligent audience, rather than someone who could have corrected his slides." She didn't say any of that, because it wasn't relevant to what this conversation was building toward, and because she had learned, slowly, and then all at once, that the most powerful thing a woman in her position could do was to let her work speak at its actual volume. "I want to propose a formal partnership structure," Augusto said. "Not acquisition, partnership. Ferraz provides the infrastructure, the manufacturing capacity, the regulatory relationships. Meridian remains yours entirely. We go to market together." Helena looked at him steadily. "And the board presentation. I was thinking Washington, the industry summit in 2 months. If the data holds, and I believe it holds, we walk in there and we change the conversation." She thought of Leonardo briefly and without drama, thought of the conferences he'd attended, the deals he'd built, the empire he'd constructed with the particular confidence of a man who had never seriously considered that the person across the dinner table from him might be building something larger. The thought arrived and departed cleanly, like weather. "It holds," she said. Augusto raised his glass. She raised hers. The bay behind them had gone fully dark now. The bridge lights strung across the water like a sentence the city was still finishing. Around them, the room hummed with the particular energy of an industry that didn't yet know it was about to be interrupted. Helena felt it, the specific, clean-aired feeling of a life finally operating at its actual capacity. Not the managed smallness of the last 5 years, not the careful containment of a woman making herself fit a room she'd been quietly outgrowing the entire time. Something else. Something that fit her exactly. The conversation continued. The wine was excellent. The view was extraordinary. And across the bay and across the country, in a Manhattan office where a 41-page report still sat on a mahogany desk, a phone buzzed with the first of what would become many notifications. A name appearing in an industry newsletter, in a financial wire, in a brief but pointed mention in an aerospace trade publication, Helena Montenegro, previously unknown, emerging as key figure in. The notification went unread until morning. By then, it would not be the last. Los Angeles was the kind of city that made everything feel like a premiere. Even a conference, even a Tuesday morning in a convention center off Figueroa Street, where 1,200 people in expensive clothes moved through registration lines with the practiced ease of people who attended things like this, the way other people went to the grocery store. The Apex Aerospace Technology Summit occupied the entirety of the convention center's east wing, and by 9:15, the corridors already had the particular charge of a room full of people who understood that the next decade of their industry was going to look radically different from the last one, and that whoever positioned themselves correctly in the next 18 months would define what that difference looked like. Leonardo had almost not come. He had stood in his apartment at 6:30 that morning, tie half knotted, coffee untouched, staring at the conference agenda on his phone with the particular paralysis of a man who was no longer entirely sure which version of himself was supposed to show up to things like this. The Castelli Aerospace name still opened every door. The empire was still standing, battered at the edges by what Daniel Prado had begun calling, with careful understatement, significant market repositioning, but standing. He was still Leonardo Castelli. He just wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. Ricardo had called at 6:45. "You're going," he'd said without greeting or preamble. "Cars outside in 10 minutes. Leonardo had finished knotting the tie. He saw her before she saw him. That was the thing he would come back to later. The specific, almost cinematic quality of that first moment, the way the geometry of the room seemed to arrange itself around the fact of her presence before his conscious mind had fully registered what his eyes were seeing. She was across the main hall, near a cluster of exhibition panels, deep in conversation with 2 men he didn't recognize, one of them in a NASA contractor badge, the other in the quiet, precise suit of someone from European capital. She was wearing a deep plum blazer over her ivory blouse, her dark hair down in a way she almost never wore it when she lived in his house, and she was talking with her hands the way she never talked at his dinners, animated, certain, taking up exactly as much space as she needed. He stopped walking. Somewhere behind him, Ricardo almost collided with him and recovered smoothly. "There she is," Ricardo said quietly, not quite to himself. Leonardo didn't respond. He couldn't, quite. Because the woman across the room, the woman who was currently making 2 industry professionals lean slightly forward, pulled by the gravity of whatever she was saying, was simultaneously the most familiar person in the world to him and someone he felt with a cold and clarifying certainty that he was seeing for the first time. He watched her for 40 seconds, maybe longer. She gestured toward one of the exhibition panels, something technical, a diagram of some kind, and the NASA contractor nodded with the expression of a man revising his assumptions in real time. She said something that made both men laugh, and the laugh was... It was real, it reached her eyes. It was the laugh of someone who was comfortable in the room they were standing in. He had never once seen her laugh like that in their home. The thought arrived like something physical. Then she turned. He didn't know if she felt it before she saw him, or if the eye contact was simply random. The unconscious radar of 2 people who had shared a bed for 5 years, locating each other in a crowd. Either way, their eyes met across 40 feet of conference hall floor, and the noise of the room seemed to reorganize itself around the silence between them. She didn't look away. She didn't smile, didn't gesture, didn't do any of the things people do when an encounter catches them off guard. She simply looked at him, directly, steadily, with an expression so composed it made the breath stop somewhere in his chest. And then, after a moment that seemed to occupy more time than it actually contained, she returned her attention to the men she was speaking with, as if he were simply part of the scenery, as if he were simply someone she had noticed and assessed and found, for the moment, irrelevant. It was the most devastating thing she could have done, and she had done it without effort. He found himself moving toward her before he'd decided to. Ricardo caught his arm, not firmly, just a touch. "Give it a minute," he said quietly. "I just want to—" "She's in a meeting, Leonardo." He stopped, and Ricardo was right. She was in a meeting in the middle of a professional conversation, and he had no standing to interrupt it, and the fact that he had instinctively moved toward her as though standing still were not an option told him something about himself that he wasn't ready to sit with. He took a position near one of the tall windows instead, with a coffee he didn't drink, and he watched. Over the next hour, he watched Helena Montenegro move through that room the way a person moves through a space they belong to completely. She knew people, not in the performed, strategic way of conference networking, but in the way of someone who had built actual relationships in an actual field over an actual career. A woman from a Japanese aerospace firm greeted her with something that looked like genuine warmth. A panel moderator stopped her specifically to ask a question, and the brief exchange that followed drew two other people into an impromptu circle. Every conversation she entered, she elevated. By 11 o'clock, she had spoken to more people than he had. And at 11:15, moving between sessions in the corridor near the east stairwell, she walked directly toward him. He didn't know if it was intentional. The corridor was narrow, the foot traffic moving in both directions, and perhaps she simply hadn't seen him until they were close enough that stopping would have been more deliberate than continuing. But she did see him. He watched the precise moment her eyes registered his presence, the single beat of adjustment in her expression, and she kept walking. He stepped slightly to the side, not blocking but present. "Helena." She stopped. The people moving past them on either side created a strange bubble of relative privacy in the middle of the crowd. Leonardo, her voice was what it always was, measured, unhurried, giving nothing away. "You look—" He stopped, started again. "You look well." Something shifted almost imperceptibly at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, the ghost of one, or perhaps its opposite. "I am well," she said. "I've been—" He stopped again because what was he going to say? "I've been reading a 41-page report about your life. I've been standing at windows trying to remember your last name. I've been trying to reach you. I know." 2 words, carrying the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Someone called her name from the far end of the corridor. A man in a Ferraz aerospace lanyard, gesturing toward a conference room door that was beginning to close. She glanced toward it, then back at Leonardo with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely, entirely finished. "I have a session," she said, and she walked past him, close enough that he caught, for one unguarded second, the faint scent of her perfume, something warm and unfamiliar, something she hadn't worn when she lived in his house, and continued down the corridor without looking back. Leonardo stood very still in the moving crowd. Around him, the conference continued, deals forming, futures being negotiated, the industry repositioning itself one conversation at a time. Someone clapped him on the shoulder in passing and said his name with the confidence of an old acquaintance. He responded automatically, correctly, like the professional he was, but his eyes were still on the conference room door that had just closed behind her, and somewhere in his chest, beneath the expensive suit and the practiced composure and the 5-year certainty that he had understood exactly who Helena Castelli was, something was pulling loose. Something that felt, disturbingly and undeniably, like the beginning of a reckoning he had no idea how to prepare for. New York received him back like a city that had stopped waiting. There was no fanfare in the return, just the familiar descent through grey cloud cover, the geometric precision of the grid materializing below, the particular density of a city that operates at full capacity regardless of what is happening in any individual life inside it. Leonardo watched it through the window of the private jet and felt, for the first time in the 15 years since he'd built Castelli Aerospace, into something this city was proud of, like a visitor. Daniel Prado was waiting at the office. This was not a good sign. Daniel, restructuring specialist, financial surgeon, the man you called when the situation required someone who could look at a bleeding balance sheet without flinching, did not wait in lobbies unless the conversation he needed to have could not wait until a scheduled meeting. He was standing near the reception desk with a tablet in one hand and an expression he was working very hard to keep neutral, and when Leonardo walked in, Daniel simply said, "Boardroom, now," and turned without waiting for a response. The boardroom had a view of the East River that Leonardo had always considered one of the finest in the city. He didn't look at it today. Daniel set the tablet on the table and turned it to face him. "I'm going to show you 3 things," he said. "I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Leonardo pulled out a chair and sat. "Go." The first thing was a capital flow report. Clean, clinical, devastating in the way that clean and clinical things often are. 3 significant institutional investors had quietly reduced their Castelli aerospace positions in the past 6 weeks, 2 of them by margins that, individually, would have been unremarkable. Together, they represented a signal. Markets didn't move randomly. Markets moved because someone knew something, or suspected something, and acted on it before the information became public. "Who's talking?" Leonardo asked, which was not the question Daniel had asked him to hold. "No one's talking," Daniel said patiently. "That's the problem. When people talk, you can manage the narrative. This is quiet. Quiet is harder." The second thing was a contract review summary. 4 long-term procurement agreements, 2 with defense contractors, 1 with a European satellite consortium, 1 with a commercial launch provider, had been returned to their legal teams for what the counterparties were describing as routine reassessment. 4 contracts in 6 weeks, all described the same way. Nothing routine about it. "They're all in sectors adjacent to propulsion efficiency," Daniel said. "Specifically, next-generation orbital propulsion. Which is, I'm going to assume you've noticed, the exact space where—" "I've noticed," Leonardo said. Daniel looked at him steadily. "Her name is appearing in every conversation I'm having, Leonardo. Every single one. Not aggressively, not combatively, just appearing. Like weather. Like something everyone has already accepted is coming and is positioning around accordingly." The third thing was a 1-page summary of industry chatter, the kind of informal intelligence that Daniel assembled through a network of contacts that operated just below the level of official discourse. Names, fragments, directional indicators. The phrase meridian technology appeared 4 times. Montenegro appeared 7. Castelli appeared twice, both times in the context of companies evaluating alternatives. Leonardo read it twice. Then he set it face down on the table. "The board wants a meeting," Daniel said. "I know, Margaret has been—" "Not a scheduled meeting." Daniel's voice was careful. "An emergency session. They've requested it for Friday." The room was quiet for a moment. Through the windows, the East River moved with its usual impassive purpose, carrying whatever it carried toward whatever came next. "They're not panicking," Daniel continued. "I want to be clear about that. But they're asking questions that require answers, and right now the answers we have are—" He paused, choosing the word with the precision of someone who understood that this particular conversation would be remembered. "Insufficient." "What are they asking?" "They want to know the company's position relative to Meridian. They want to know if we have any comparable technology in development. They want to know—" Another pause. "What our exposure is if the Montenegro IP goes to market at the efficiency numbers that are circulating." Leonardo stood. He walked to the window. Outside, a barge moved downriver, slow and enormous, pushing against the current. "And what's our position?" he asked, though he already knew. "Our position," Daniel said quietly, "is that 18 months ago, we had no reason to develop a competing technology because there was no competing technology to compete with. Our position is that we are currently the best in a field that is about to be redefined by someone we did not see coming." He let that sit. "That's our position." Leonardo pressed one hand flat against the window glass. It was cold. The city below moved without him, indifferent and relentless. "I'll speak to the board Friday," he said. "There's one more thing." Daniel's voice had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more careful. the way voices shift when a conversation moves from professional to something adjacent to personal. The board is going to ask about your relationship with Dr. Montenegro, your previous relationship. They're going to want to know if there's any possibility of a direct conversation, a negotiation, a partnership inquiry, anything that might— No, Leonardo said. Leonardo. The answer is no. He turned from the window. Not yet. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded once. He gathered his materials with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned when to press and when to let a room breathe. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, the people who've met her in person, the investors, the conference contacts, the Faraz people, they all say the same thing. A beat. That she's extraordinary. That she's the kind of person who makes you wonder what you missed. The door closed. Leonardo stood alone in the boardroom for a long time. The tablet sat face down on the table. The river moved below. The city held its noise at the careful distance that 40 floors of glass and steel provides, reducing it to something that could almost be mistaken for silence. At 8:47 that evening, he picked up his phone. He found her contact. Helena. Still no last name. He would fix that. He had already fixed it in every other record, had written Montenegro somewhere in his mind in permanent ink, but in his phone she was still just Helena, and maybe that was its own kind of honesty. He pressed call. It rang 3 times. The sound of each ring occupied its own small eternity. Then the line opened. He heard her breath. Just one. The specific quiet of a person who has looked at a screen and made a decision. He opened his mouth to say her name, and the line went dead. She had answered. She had listened to the silence of his unspoken word, and then she had hung up without saying anything at all. Leonardo lowered the phone slowly. Outside, New York blazed against the dark with its 10,000 windows and its 10,000 stories, none of which had any interest in his. He set the phone face down on the table, and in the particular silence of a boardroom that had hosted the shaping of an empire, he sat with the knowledge that the empire was no longer the most important thing in the room. Something else was, something that had answered his call and then hung up without a word, which was he was beginning to understand exactly what he deserved. For now. Malibu in November had a particular quality of light that felt almost accusatory. Not the warm, performative gold of summer, something harsher, more honest. The kind of light that arrived low and direct off the Pacific and illuminated things without flattery. The Castellan resort sat above the water on a bluff that made the ocean feel like something personal, close enough that you could hear it through closed windows, a constant low presence beneath every conversation, every silence, every moment of pretending you were somewhere else entirely. Helena had not known Leonardo would be there, or at least that was what she told herself in the car from the airport, watching the coastline unspool outside the window with the careful neutrality of someone deciding in advance how they would behave when a situation required it. Augusto had been straightforward about the logistics, a 3-day negotiation, a Faraz team, a crisis mediation over a disputed satellite launch contract that had entangled 3 companies and 2 government agencies into something nobody wanted litigated. Neutral ground, he'd said. Malibu in November. Bring the propulsion data. Bring Gabriel from legal. Bring your best version of patient. She had not asked who else would be there. This was, she acknowledged privately as the car pulled into the resort's circular drive, either an oversight or a choice she hadn't been ready to examine. She was still deciding which when she saw the Castelli aerospace vehicles in the parking bay. 2 black SUVs, a driver she recognized from New York, and felt something move through her that was neither surprise nor quite its opposite. She smoothed her jacket, deep burgundy, fitted, the kind of thing that required no adjustment but that her hands moved to anyway, and walked inside. The first day passed in the managed choreography of high-stakes negotiation. Long tables, careful language, legal teams performing their careful dances around positions that nobody was yet ready to abandon. Leonardo was across the table for 6 hours. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a sound at the edge of hearing. Not distracting exactly, but present in a way that required some portion of her attention to manage. He was professional. So was she. They addressed each other when necessary, with the clipped courtesy of opposing counsel, and when their eyes met across the table it was brief and functional, and told neither of them anything they hadn't already known. It was in the second day's afternoon break that everything contracted. The main negotiating room had grown airless with the particular staleness of a space that had hosted too many hours of careful dishonesty, and Helena had stepped out through the side doors onto one of the resort's terraced balconies, without particularly thinking about where she was going, just following the pull of cold, salt air and open sky. The Pacific spread itself below in shades of grey and deep pewter, enormous and indifferent, the kind of view that makes personal problems feel appropriately sized. She heard the door open behind her. She knew before she turned. Leonardo stepped onto the balcony and stopped when he saw her, a half-second of visible hesitation, genuine enough that she believed it. He could have retreated. The door was still within reach. Instead, after that brief pause, he moved to the railing several feet away and looked out at the water, and they stood in that configuration, parallel, not quite together, not quite separate, for a long moment without speaking. The ocean filled the silence between them with something that was almost merciful. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said finally. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the water. Helena. Her name in his mouth had changed. She noticed it without meaning to, something stripped from it, some of the certainty that had always been there, the unconscious ownership of a man who had never considered that the name might not entirely belong to him. "I owe you. You don't need to do this here." "Then when?" His voice was quiet, but there was something raw beneath the quiet, something she recognized as genuine and found, because of that, more difficult to dismiss than performance would have been. "You don't answer calls." "You don't—" "I answered once," she said. A beat. "You didn't say anything," she continued. "You called, and then you were silent, and I listened to that silence for 4 seconds, and I thought—" She stopped, edited herself. "It doesn't matter what I thought. It matters to me." She turned to look at him then, and she wished immediately that she had waited a moment longer, because his face was wrong. It was wrong in the specific way of a face that has let go of the mask it usually wears, and what was underneath it was something she had not prepared herself to see. He looked tired, not in the surface way of a man who hadn't slept, but in the deeper way of a man who had been arguing with himself for weeks and was losing. "I read the report," he said. She waited. Ottavio's report, everything. He turned back to the water, his hands on the railing, and she could see in the line of his shoulders the particular tension of a man assembling himself to say something he's rehearsed and finding, in the moment, that the rehearsal was useless. "Your degrees. The work you were doing during our marriage. Your father's company, all of it." A pause. "I didn't know your last name, Helena. My own wife's last name." The ocean moved below them. A pelican crossed the frame of the view, low and deliberate. "I know you didn't," she said. Her voice was even. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not here to ask you for anything." He turned to face her, and his voice, when it came, was the most undefended she had ever heard it. "I just need you to know that I understand what I did, what I failed to do. I had a person, a remarkable, extraordinary person, in my house, in my life, and I never once asked who she was. I treated you like scenery." The word seemed to hurt him to say, "And I am so deeply sorry for that." Helena looked at him for a long moment. She had imagined versions of this conversation, had imagined them in the abstract, on planes and in hotel rooms, with the detached intellectual curiosity of a person examining a scenario they no longer needed. In those imagined versions, she had been impervious. She had been a closed system, complete and contained, entirely unmoved. She was not entirely unmoved. This was information she filed carefully away, behind the composed expression and the steady gaze. "I know you are," she said quietly. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I don't want your absolution, Helena. I don't deserve it yet. I just—" He searched for the words and seemed to find them insufficient. I wanted you to hear it from me, without lawyers, without strategy. Just this. The wind off the ocean moved between them, cold and salt-laced and entirely without opinion. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had stopped letting herself look across conference tables and convention hall floors, and saw for just a moment, beneath the erosion of recent weeks, the man she had married. Not the billionaire, not the force of nature, just a man standing in November light, stripped of his usual armor, asking for nothing except to be heard. It was the most dangerous version of him she had ever encountered. She took one breath. Then she stepped back from the railing. "We should go back inside," she said. "The afternoon session starts in 10 minutes. She moved toward the door, her hand closed around the handle. "Helena." She paused but did not turn. "The photograph," he said. "The one you took from the study. The lab photo. A beat. You were happy in it. I didn't recognize the look at first because I'd never seen it on you before." Her hand tightened slightly on the handle, something she would not allow to show on her face. "I'm that happy now," she said quietly. And she went inside, and the door closed behind her, and the Pacific continued its enormous, indifferent conversation with the bluff below, while Leonardo stood alone on the balcony in the low November light, with the words she'd left him ringing in the cold air, and the particular understanding that what he had just heard was simultaneously the most painful and the most hopeful thing anyone had said to him in years. The interview had not been her idea. Claire Ashworth, features editor at Meridian Business Quarterly, had been persistent in the particular way of journalists who understand that the right story told at the right moment can shift the entire center of gravity of a conversation. 3 requests over 6 weeks, each one more precisely argued than the last. Helena had finally said yes, not because she'd been worn down, but because she'd woken one morning and understood that silence, which had once been her protection, was no longer something she needed. She was done being invisible. The cafe was quiet. Claire recorded everything on a small device between their coffee cups and asked questions with the focused patience of someone who had done her homework. Helena answered in the way she did everything now, directly without performance, taking up exactly the space the truth required. She talked about MIT, about the years of work that had preceded the degrees and the years of work that had followed them, about the particular discipline of developing Meridian in the margins of a life that hadn't been structured around her ambitions. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The shape of what she described, the invisible years, the deliberate smallness, the choice to love someone at the expense of being fully known, was its own kind of portrait. "Did you resent it?" Claire asked. "The invisibility?" Helena considered the question honestly. "I chose it," she said. "That's different from having it taken from you. But yes, there were mornings when I sat with work I was proud of and had no one to show it to." She paused. "That particular loneliness has a very specific weight." Claire nodded, wrote something. "And now?" Helena looked out the window at the grey San Francisco morning. "Now I'm exactly where I should be." Across town, Augusto read the published piece on his phone over breakfast. Helena sitting across from him at the same cafe table they'd claimed as a kind of unofficial office over the past several weeks. He read slowly, with the attention he gave everything, and when he finished he set the phone down and looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize, precise, warm, slightly complicated. "You wrote around him carefully," Augusto said. "I wrote around the parts that weren't mine to publish," she corrected. Augusto was quiet for a moment. "Helena," his voice was measured. "The Malibu session, the way you were after." He chose his next words with the care of a man who respected what he was stepping near. "Is there something unfinished there?" The question sat between them, clean and direct, the way Augusto always was. Helena looked down at her coffee cup. Her hands, wrapped around the warm ceramic, held it with a steadiness she had to concentrate on maintaining. She didn't answer, but her silence, specific, weighted, tilted with something she hadn't yet named aloud, answered for her. Washington in December had the gravity of a city that understood consequence. The Hart Senate Office Building's main conference hall had been repurposed for the occasion, rows of seats filled with the kind of people whose decisions shaped budgets, treaties, and the technological direction of an entire nation. NASA administrators, defense contractors, 3 senators on the aerospace subcommittee, a gallery of industry figures who had rearranged their calendars specifically for this presentation. Gabriel Montero, Helena's legal counsel, leaned close as they waited in the anteroom. "Full room," he said quietly. "Every seat." "Good," Helena said. She was wearing a deep rose blazer over ivory, her dark hair pulled back with the clean precision of someone who understood that today was not about appearance, but had dressed accordingly anyway. She held no notes. Everything she needed was already organized in the architecture of a mind that had been preparing for this moment, in one form or another, for the better part of a decade. Ricardo had told Leonardo 3 days ago, not as a warning, as an instruction. You need to be there. You need to see this with your own eyes. Leonardo sat in the 4th row, no Castelli insignia, no entourage. Just a man in a dark suit, hands clasped, waiting. Helena walked out to measured applause and stood at the podium with the stillness of someone who had never needed a room's approval to know their own worth. She let the quiet settle. Then she began. She spoke for 34 minutes. She spoke about propulsion efficiency with the clarity of someone translating the profound into the accessible without sacrificing a single layer of complexity. She walked the room through Meridian's development, the data, the methodology, the implications. When she presented the efficiency figures, someone in the 3rd row actually said God under their breath, and the ripple of recalibration that moved through the audience was almost visible. Leonardo didn't move. He watched her command that room, watched senators lean forward, watched industry veterans exchange glances that said, "This changes things," and felt something happening in his chest that had nothing to do with the empire she was threatening and everything to do with the woman he had spent 5 years failing to see. She was extraordinary, not in the abstract way he'd read in Ottavio's report or absorbed through conference corridors and industry whispers. Extraordinarily specifically here, in this room, in this moment, in the full-volume expression of everything she'd kept quiet while living in his house. When she finished, the applause was immediate and full. Helena looked up from the podium as the sound crested, and across the rows of standing people, her eyes found him. No searching. No accident. Direct and certain, as though she'd known exactly where he was the entire time. Leonardo held her gaze. Neither of them looked away. And in that suspended moment, above the applause, above the consequence, above everything the next hour would bring, something passed between them that neither of them could have named, but both of them recognized. He came on a Friday night without warning. No lawyers, no intermediaries, no carefully worded message sent ahead to prepare the ground. Just Leonardo Castelli standing in the hallway outside her San Francisco apartment at 8:15 in the evening, in a dark coat, holding an envelope. Not a legal one, not the kind Ottavio Mendez would deliver. A plain white envelope with her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized as his, but had never seen unguarded before. Smaller than she expected. Less certain. Helena opened the door and looked at him. He looked back. No performance in it. No strategy. Just a man standing in the particular exposure of someone who has stripped every defense and chosen to show up anyway. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I'm not here to ask for anything that belongs to your lawyers or mine." He held out the envelope. "I just needed you to have this." She took it, didn't open it, stepped back from the door. He walked in. The apartment was everything his Manhattan penthouse was not. Warm, specific, full of the particular evidence of a person who lived in a space rather than occupied it. Books with broken spines, a drafting table near the window covered in schematics, a photograph on the shelf, different from the lab photo, newer Helena at the Washington podium, caught mid-sentence, completely alive. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Open it," he said quietly. "Please." She unfolded the letter inside. 3 pages handwritten, the penmanship of a man unaccustomed to vulnerability, but attempting it anyway. Imperfect, earnest, real. She read it standing, and he watched her read it, and he did not try to fill the silence with anything. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It did not make promises. It named things, specific things, true things. The dinners where she'd sat quietly while he'd held court on subjects she understood better than he did. The conferences he'd attended without once considering she might have wanted to come. The 5 years of mornings where he'd looked at her and seen wife instead of person. The name he'd never learned. The work he'd never asked about. The laugh he'd never heard until Los Angeles. He named all of it, without excuse. When she finished, she folded the pages carefully and held them at her side. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the city moved through its Friday night with its customary indifference to individual reckoning. "I don't deserve you," he said. "I know that. I'm not standing here because I think I do." He took one step toward her, just one, leaving the distance between them hers to manage. "I'm standing here because I finally know who you are. Helena Montenegro. 2 doctorates, 47 citations, Meridian." His voice dropped. "The woman who walked into the rain without looking back because she was already certain of herself when I wasn't paying attention." Her expression moved, something crossing it that wasn't composure and wasn't its collapse, but something honest in between. "I'm not asking you to come back to what we were," he continued. "What we were wasn't enough for you. It wasn't worthy of you. I'm asking for the chance to be someone who is." He paused. "That's all. No contracts, no conditions. Just a chance." Helena looked at him for a long time. She thought of the lab photograph, of 5 years of careful smallness, of Malibu balconies and conference halls, and the specific loneliness of loving someone who had never been curious about you. She thought of Washington and the applause, and his eyes finding hers across the room, and the thing she had felt in that moment that she had not yet said aloud to anyone, not even herself. She crossed the room, not quickly, not with the desperation of someone who had been waiting, but with the deliberate, conscious movement of a woman making a choice from a position of complete sufficiency. She didn't need him. That was what made the choice real. She stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "Helena Montenegro," she said quietly, giving him the name. All of it. The way you give something to a person you have decided to trust with it. Something broke open in his face. He reached for her, carefully asking with his hands before he moved. And when she didn't step back, he pulled her close, and the embrace that followed was nothing like the careful, social contact of their married life. It was the embrace of 2 people who had finally, after an enormous amount of wasted time, arrived at the same honest place simultaneously. She felt his arms tighten, felt him exhale, long, ragged, real. "Say it again," he murmured against her hair. "Helena Montenegro," she said, and she felt him hold the name like something he intended this time never to let go of. Outside, San Francisco carried on. The bay reflected its 10,000 lights without comment. The world continued at its customary pace, indifferent to the specific gravity of 2 people standing in a warm apartment, finally, imperfectly, honestly, irreversibly, finding each other. The letter sat on the table beside them, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence between them held nothing that needed to be hidden. She never needed saving. She needed to be seen, and in the end, it wasn't the empire, the patents, or the applause that changed Leonardo Castelli. It was the quiet devastation of realizing that the most extraordinary person in his life had been standing in front of him all along, waiting to be asked a single honest question. How many people do we walk beside every day, never truly seeing them? If this story touched your heart, subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Leave a like. It truly keeps these stories alive. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from.